Hello, I'm Mark Christ. I'm the head of adult programming for the Central Arkansas Library System, and I'm also a Civil War historian, having written or edited a dozen books on the Civil War in Arkansas. And I am continuing the Central Arkansas Library System's series of videos about the Civil War in Arkansas. Today we're going to be talking about the Camden Expedition of 1864. In the spring of 1864, around 12,000 Union soldiers set out from Little Rock and Fort Smith to rendezvous with another Union army at Shreveport, Louisiana, and then invade Texas, seizing the cotton-rich eastern part of that state to raise the Stars and Stripes in rebel territory and send cotton to the idle textile mills in the northeastern U.S. 42 days later, the remnants of that Union army would limp into Little Rock after a disastrous campaign that witnessed the worst racial atrocities that would occur in Arkansas during the Civil War. The commander of the Union Army was Major General Frederick Steele, a West Point classmate of U.S. Grant and a veteran of several battles in the Trans-Mississippi region, including the campaign that resulted in the capture of Little Rock on September 10, 1863. Grant considered Steele, quote, a first-rate commander of troops in battle and a splendid officer fully capable of the management of the Army of the Potomac or any of the departments. Steele was opposed to the planned march to Shreveport, knowing that the roads were bad and that the region his army would move through was almost destitute of provisions after 3 years of war. In addition, Steele feared that his army would be susceptible to attack by Confederate guerrillas and that a supply line to Little Rock would be fragile at best. Finally, he was not excited about the commander of the Louisiana component of the campaign, Major General Nathaniel Banks, who was described by one historian as the quintessential political general, politically connected, but militarily incompetent. But Steele was a soldier first and foremost, and he would follow orders. On March 23, 1864, he marched out of Little Rock at the head of 8,500 men heading south. On the same day, around 3,600 troops of the Union Frontier Division left Fort Smith, led by Brigadier General John M. Thayer, and aiming to join Steele's army at Arkadelphia, south of Little Rock. Thayer's army included the tough, battle-tested 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment, which Jim Lane had recruited from escaped slaves from Arkansas, Missouri, and Indian Territory. Lane had ignored the lack of official permission to do so and raised the Black Regiment months before Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect. The 1st Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment was organized at Fort Scott, Kansas in August of 1862 and had the distinction of being the first Black regiment to see action. In October 29, 1862, fight at Island Mound, Missouri, where the 1st was victorious and also suffered the first fatal casualties of any African-American regiment during the Civil War. The 1st Kansas had also seen combat at Honey Springs in the Indian Territory during the summer of 1862 and was part of an assault on the 29th Texas that captured their flag, an act for which the Texans would seek grisly revenge during this campaign. The black soldiers may have been amused when they found that among the equipment captured from the defeated Confederates at Honey Springs were shackles that theoretically could have been used to return them to bondage. The 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry was organized at Fort Scott and Fort Leavenworth between August 11 and October 17 of 1863, and they would serve most of their time in Arkansas. Both units included former slaves who escaped from bondage in Arkansas, Missouri, and Indian Territory, and now sought to fight for their freedom. As the Federal column set out from Little Rock, Confederate Major General Sterling Price prepared to defend the southern part of Arkansas. While hampered somewhat by the movement of the bulk of the Confederate infantry in the state to Louisiana to counter Banks and his army, Price ordered the tough Confederate cavalry in Arkansas into scouting and blocking positions and awaited the arrival of additional rebel troops from Indian Territory. Steele reached Arkadelphia on March 29 and waited there for Thayer until April 1st while his troops consumed precious and irreplaceable supplies. As they headed south, they began facing increasingly stiff opposition. Colonel Joseph O. Shelby's Confederate cavalry attacked the Union wagon train and rear guard on Ternar Creek on April 2, engaging in a spirited fight. Shelby hit them again the next day at Okolona, and the elements themselves seemed to conspire against the combatants. Shelby reported, "While engaged, a terrible hailstorm came up from the northeast and spread its dark wings over the sky. The scene was rugged and sublime. Amid the jar of the thunder, the flash of the lightning, and the moaning and sighing of the pines as the pitiless hailstones tore through them, there was mingled the crash of artillery, the sharp rattle of musketry, and ever and anon as the wind ceased there came the wild blare of bugles and the ring of sabers from the valley below where the enemy were fighting. Twice during the day I felt their entire line and found it nearly 2 miles long, and twice they advanced in force, but were driven back each time. I drew off at 2 o'clock and retired to the little village of Antoine." Now, Shelby's adjutant, John Newman Edwards, claimed in his post-war history of Shelby's brigade that a Union cannonball upset several beehives and that the rebels fell back only after being attacked by the enraged insects. However, given Edwards' penchant for prevarication and the fact that no contemporary accounts mention the event, the fabled Battle of the Bees most likely occurred only in Edwards' overactive imagination. Steele's army arrived at the Little Missouri River at Elkins Ferry on April 3 and crossed on the 4th, facing stiff opposition from John Sappington Marmaduke's Confederate cavalry. Private Jacob Haas of the 9th Wisconsin Infantry described the fighting at Elkins Ferry. "When our men went to meet them, the rebels retired, and ours after them until they perceived that the rebels fell back only to have other of their force cut them off. Then ours retired, and the rebels again attacked and drove them to the bank of the river. We now plainly heard heavy musket fire mingles with the roar of cannon. By this time, the 29th Iowa had crossed the river to aid them, and now we and our battery went over in the midst of a rain of rebel bullets. Cannon now roared from both sides. When we followed the roar of our cannon, our brave General Rice met us and gave welcome in the words, 'We will send these traitors to hell before we leave this place.' But we were stunned when we saw blood run down both sides of his face and saw pain in his features. When we expressed our sympathy, he only said, 'It is a pity because of my cap, because it cost me $5 and it is entirely torn.' A piece of shell had torn the cap and wounded him in the head. It came very close to taking his life." The rebels eventually fell back to Prairie du Chien, where they had built formidable breastworks to protect the approaches to their state capital in the village of Washington. Well, Steele's army waited at the widow Cornelius's farm until Thayer's troops finally arrived on April 9 after a torturous march through the mountains of western Arkansas, unfortunately without supplies. Steele, with his men already on half rations, sent a plea for supplies to Little Rock and then advanced against the rebels entrenched at Prairie du Chien. The two armies skirmished for several days on the prairie before Steele finally ordered an all-out assault on April 12. A.F. Sperry of the 33rd Iowa Infantry described the event. "Before 6 the next morning, our whole force was again in battle array and advancing toward the enemy. The skirmishing was at all times quite lively. Our batteries would open on the rebels and speedily silence and scatter them. At about 9 o'clock, we reached the edge of the woods and entered the rebel camp, which their rear guard had just evacuated. Over a mile of very passable breastworks, alternated with places for cannon of such range they could have literally mowed us down in a direct assault, were now in our possession, with hardly any loss, and we were much pleased at the result of a flanking movement. As the Confederates fell back toward their capital at Washington in southwest Arkansas, Steele turned his hungry army toward Camden on the Washita River and, hopefully, food." As the Yankees lost their tactical initiative and they turned toward Camden, Price ordered rebel cavalry under Samuel Bell Maxey and Thomas Dockery to attack on April 13th. Price wrote that the enemy was strongly posted near Moscow on a skirt of timber on the edge of the prairie and would not venture beyond it. Dockery, being in the advance, attacked with great intrepidity and at one time captured a section of artillery, but which was afterward retaken by a greatly superior force and his troops driven back with some loss. Private Henry Strong of the 12th Kansas Infantry wrote that the rebels attacked us. They drove in our pickets and were in our camp before we were aware of their approach. We were in line until dark, got a good long look at them and heard cannonballs whistling over our heads. It was the hardest kind of artillery firing for a little while. Union reports for Thayer's Frontier Division stated that the brigade was engaged in action against the forces of the enemy under the command of Generals Maxey and Dockery at Moscow, Arkansas. The action commenced at 1 p.m. and lasted until 5 p.m. The 2nd Indiana Battery fired 210 shots, solid and shell, and used grape and canister with good effect. The enemy were repulsed and driven 4 miles when the brigade, under cover of night, withdrew and resumed the advance. The loss on our side was 7 killed and 24 wounded. Well, the ravenous Federals reached Camden on April 15. Camden merchant John Brown recorded the event in his diary, writing, "The awful day of all days, the dread event feared for years. About 6 o'clock, an enemy, infuriated by combat and hunger, came rushing down our main street and diverging into the cross streets. The soldiers dashed to our doors, demanding food. I soon handed out all the victuals which were on hand cooked. After dark, they broke into the smokehouse and commenced carrying off as they wanted." Mrs. Virginia McCollum Stinson also remembered April 15, writing, "When the Yankees came, Kate, my young lady's sister, ran in the house and said, 'Sis, the Yankees are almost here.' Such a noise did they make, shooting guns and pistols and the tramp of feet and yelling of voices. It was distressing indeed. I gathered my household together and closed my doors and blinds. No glad welcome was extended them. Our hearts were lifted to God in prayer for protection. They were as thick as blackbirds in springtime and chattering in louder voices." There was, unfortunately for the Yankees, no great store of food in Camden, and the soldiers were not the only invaders lacking in provender. Charles Henry, the chief quartermaster of Steele's army, observed that there were about 800 wagons and nearly 12,000 public animals with the command on the 15th day of April. The difficulty of procuring forage occasions great uneasiness, as we were without any base of supplies and with an active enemy in front. The Federals did have some luck. On April 16th, a detachment of the 1st Iowa Cavalry and 3rd Missouri Cavalry captured the Steamboat Homer some 30 miles below Camden. The vessel was, quote, "laden with corn and other quartermaster and commissary supplies. Lieutenant J.T. Foster of Company B, 1st Iowa, an old Mississippi River steamboat pilot, took the wheel and piloted the boat back to Camden." And just as an aside, I find this one of the interesting things about the nature of a volunteer army, that a Iowa cavalry unit would have a riverboat pilot among its horsemen. Anyways, the Homer contained between 3,000 and 5,000 bushels of corn, among other supplies. Robert McMahon of the 25th Ohio Battery noted in his diary, "2 barrels of whiskey on board, all got pretty jolly. 4,000 bushels of corn on board, a great prize." The Union Army still needed more, though, so on April 17th, Steele sent a forage train to seize 500 bushels of corn stored 16 miles west of Camden. Among the escort for the 198 wagon train were 428 men and officers from the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. After seizing half the corn, Confederate troops managed to burn half, the party headed back toward Camden, with empty wagons branching out to seize additional food. The Yankees also stole almost anything else that caught their fancy and piled it into the wagons. One rebel indignantly reported that the wagons were laden with every kind of provision from the farmyard, the pantry, the dairy, and the sideboard, men's, women's, and children's clothing, household furniture, gardening implements, the tools of the mechanic, and the poor contents of the Negro hut. Another Southerner noted that they had feather beds and all the comforts about one's home in their wagons, clothing, etc. An outraged Texan wrote, "To see the plunder they had in their wagons, hogs, chickens, ducks, ladies' dresses, and even children's clothes, things of no use to them, stolen through mere wantonage." As a Federal escort increased to 1,169 men with the arrival of a relief column, marched toward Camden, they encountered Confederate pickets at Poison Spring. As the Yankees halted, Brigadier General John Sappington Marmaduke rushed 3,621 rebel cavalry and artillerymen to confront the Union troops with an L-shaped ambush. The 1st Kansas took position at the front of the train and fought off 2 attacks. Bloodied and low on ammunition, the black soldiers were overwhelmed by a 3rd well-coordinated assault. Lieutenant Richard L. Phillips of the 6th Kansas Cavalry wrote that, "My men acted as well as men could under the circumstances, for the enemy were following the Negroes and pouring a heavy fire into their ranks." Another Yankee reported that he could distinctly see the rebels shooting our brave but fatigued boys. Confederate Brigadier General William L. Cabell noted in his official report of the battle the excessive casualties suffered by the black troops. He wrote, "The number of killed of the enemy was very great, especially among the Negroes. You could track our troops by the dead bodies lying on the ground. I estimated his loss from what I saw and heard from reliable officers as followed. Killed, Negroes 450, Indians 7, white troops 30, total 487. Morgan's regiment, which was stationed in the Camden Road east of the battleground, killed at least 80 Negroes and captured 35 prisoners. My whole command captured 62 prisoners, 58 white troops and 4 Negroes. The entire federal force soon collapsed before the Confederate advance and fled toward Camden, and the nightmare began for the survivors of the 1st Kansas. Soldiers of the 29th Texas Cavalry, who had come out second best to the Kansans in the fighting at Honey Springs in Indian Territory the previous year, looked for surviving blacks to finish off. As they stalked the battlefield, they shouted to each other, "Where's the 1st Kansas Negro now? All cut to pieces and gone to hell by bad management." An Arkansas trooper described the battlefield in a letter to the Washington Telegraph. "We rode over the field after the battle, and we beheld so many stalwart Negroes weltering in their gore, we could not suppress a sigh over their hard fate. The poor dupes of a miserable set of fanatics and demagogues. Would it not have been better, could we have captured these able-bodied men, to have taken them back to the interior and put them to hard work? Light work compared to the burthens of their present taskmaster." A particularly chilling letter came from Alfred Hearn of Arkadelphia, who wrote to his wife on April 20, and what makes the Hearn letter stand out is the fact that he personally knew many of the black men who were killed at Poison Spring. Hearn wrote, on Monday last, the 18th, we had a fight at the Poison Springs on the Camden and Washington Road, 15 miles from Camden. A foraging party, variously estimated from 2,000 to 4,000, we attacked at 12 o'clock by cannonading them and then by small arms, which lasted for 3 hours, and the enemy was completely routed, capturing 200 wagons and about 1,250 mules, and killed from 400 to 600 and captured about 100 prisoners. It was a running fight. They were chased by the soldiers that we were with about 3 miles on foot, and then the cavalry took them in hand and don't know how far they pursued. I have said fed, yes, of deepest dye Negroes. I think there were 10 Negroes killed to 1 white fed. Just as I had said before, they made the Negroes go in front, and if the Negro was wounded, our men would shoot him dead as they were passed, and what Negroes that were captured have, from the best information I can obtain, since been shot. I've seen enough myself to know it is correct. Our men is determined to not take Negro prisoners, and if all the Negroes could have seen what occurred that day, they would stay at home. What I've seen reminds me of the talk I gave Henry and John, who I assume were slaves of the Hearn family. They may have been there, as I have had no information as yet from home. If so, they are convinced by this time. I can't believe that either went. Among the killed was Dr. Rollins Clade and Kyles Berry, and Old Man Edwards' boy was captured. I've told how they were disposed of. And here is the state park at Poison Spring in Ouachita County. Chilling place to visit. So Tandy Walker's brigade of Choctaw Indians was particularly brutal in their treatment of the men of the 1st Kansas Colored. Lieutenant William M. Stafford, a Texas artilleryman, wrote that the havoc among the Negroes had been tremendous. Over a small portion of the field, we saw at least 40 dead bodies lying in all conceivable attitudes, some scalped and nearly all stripped by the bloodthirsty Choctaws. Private Charles T. Anderson of the 2nd Arkansas Cavalry wrote, "You ought to see Indians fight Negroes, kill and scalp them. Let me tell you, I never expected to see as many dead Negroes again. They were so thick you could walk on them." C.H. Pidcock, a soldier of the 30th Texas Cavalry, wrote, "The Indians were turned loose just about the time our brigade had them whipped. Gentlemen of the colored race suffered. The Choctaws killed every black and stripped everything both black and white. Some of these Choctaws can carry bigger loads than their pony. One man says he saw a Choctaw with his arm broke carrying off the effects of 7 dead blacks, guns, and ammo. The slaughter of the darkies may seem inhumane to some people, but I for one cry bully for the Choctaw." And the Choctaws even desecrated black corpses. The Washington Telegraph, the nearest Confederate newspaper to the scene of the slaughter, reported the following example under the headline "Choctaw Humor." After the Battle of Poison Springs, the Choctaws buried a Yankee in an ordinary grave. For a headstone, they put up a stiff Negro buried to the waist. For a footstone, another Negro reversed out from the waist to the heels. A Confederate soldier interviewed by the Arkansas Gazette 80 years after the Battle of Poison Springs said that, "I still shudder when I remember that terrible scene of death." Now, the Choctaws may have been seeking revenge for a Union raid 2 months earlier into the Choctaw Nation. Union Commander William A. Phillips had ordered his troops, which included some African American soldiers, quote, to make your footsteps severe and terrible, and his men followed that order in both spirit and action. After a skirmish at Middle Boggy on February 9, 1864, Union troops slashed the throats of wounded Confederates on the field. A former Creek slave serving in the 1st Union Home Guard remembered that we killed 110 rebels, mostly Indians. Most of them were killed at their homes because Colonel Phillips instructed his men not to take prisoners, for they had all the chances to come in if they wanted to do so. Colonel Daniel McIntosh, a Confederate Creek, reported that they took no prisoners but killed all without mercy. How brutal the actions of the enemy, how much savage the tribe of Indians who never heard of civilization would shudder at such barbarity. Well, the Federal troops at Poison Spring lost 204 men killed or missing and 97 wounded, of which the 1st Kansas suffered 117 killed and 65 wounded, amounting to a 42% loss for that regiment. Colonel Charles de Morse of Texas allowed that but few prisoners were brought in by my men. Confederate losses were 13 dead, 81 wounded, and 1 missing. This lopsided victory. Well, the Yankee troops in Camden were outraged. Private Henry Strong of the 12th Kansas Cavalry Infantry wrote angrily in his diary, They killed after our boys surrendered the wounded that had been put in the ambulances. If this is true, no punishment is too great for them. Samuel J. Crawford, the colonel of the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry and a veteran of the border wars, issued orders that in the future the regiment would take no prisoners as long as the rebels continued to murder our men. Well, a week after the disaster at Poison Spring, on April 25, 1864, Confederate troops crushed another Union column at Marks Mills. Confederate General James Fagan executed a converging attack on the approximately 1,800 Union troops accompanying a 240 wagon supply train heading for Pine Bluff. Fagan wrote, General Cabell's brigade opened the fight in a bold and vigorous manner. Soon Dockery's brigade was in position on the left, when it too promptly engaged the enemy. Owing to the distance General Shelby had to travel, his attack was not simultaneously with General Cabell's. Soon, however, and when Cabell's division was hotly engaged and acting in the most determined and gallant manner, General Shelby's opening guns proclaimed him in the place intended. Down he came upon the head of the enemy's train, which was now pushing to gain crossing at Mount Elba, driving everything before him, capturing many prisoners, wagons, arms, etc. The engagement was now general. The enemy's lines could not sustain the combined attack. They wavered and showed signs of giving way. Our brave troops moved upon them with terrible and crushing effect. It was not long before the enemy's forces broke in dismay and confusion, completely routed. Our victory was decided and complete. As the victorious Confederates rounded up hundreds of Union prisoners, they singled out the escaped slaves accompanying the Federal troops for punishment. Benjamin Pearson of the 36th Iowa Infantry wrote of Marks Mills that there was not an armed Negro with us, and they shot down our colored servants and teamsters and others that were following to get from bondage as they would sheep dogs. Colonel William Drake, who led the Union forces in the battle and was severely wounded, reported that a large number of Negroes were inhumanly butchered by the enemy, and among them my own Negro servant. Union Captain S.A. Swiggett reported that all male Negroes among our troops and with the train had been killed, and the women and children were huddled with us among the prisoners. A Confederate, John Newman Edwards of J.O. Shelby's Cavalry Regiment, remembered that the battlefield was sickening to behold. No orders, threats, or commands could constrain the men from vengeance on the Negroes, and they were piled in great heaps upon the wagons, in the tangled underbrush, and upon the muddy and trampled road. An Arkansas soldier wrote that he saw Shelby himself club a freedom seeker with a musket butt before drawing his revolver and killing the man. A May 21 article in the Little Rock National Democrat reported that there were with the train from 1 to 200 Negro men, women, and children. Some of the Negro men were killed on the field, 15 or 20 perhaps, but none were injured after that as far as I could learn. They were taken away with the other prisoners toward Shreveport. Well, Steele lost at least 1,500 men at Marks Mills, most of them prisoners, while Confederate losses totaled only 293 killed, wounded, and missing in one of the most lopsided victories in the Trans-Mississippi. With the loss at Marks Mills and on learning that Banks's army had been turned back in Louisiana, Steele decided that he had had enough. The Yankees calmly abandoned Camden on the night of April 26 and, stealing a march on the Confederates, made tracks for Little Rock. The rebels nipped at the retreating army's heels, skirmishing heavily at several sites, but Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith's main infantry column caught up with them at the crossing of the Saline River at Jenkins Ferry on April 30, 1864. Kirby Smith had departed from Louisiana with heavy infantry columns after thrashing Banks at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill, possibly abandoning an opportunity to destroy the larger Union Army-Navy force as it fought its way back down the Red River. The hard-marching rebels were immediately thrown into battle. Steele's infantry fought a desperate rearguard action as the rest of the army crossed the swollen river on a pontoon bridge. The terrain of the sodden battlefield caused the Confederates to funnel their infantry into disjointed attacks that the well-placed Yankees fought off while inflicting heavy casualties. Conditions were vile for the attacking Confederates, with Captain Ethan Allen Pennell of the 8th Missouri Infantry reporting that we fought in the rain and mud and water 10 inches deep. Well, during the attack, a section of Captain Samuel T. Ruffer's Missouri artillery placed 2 cannon across from the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry. The black soldiers, along with white soldiers of the 29th Iowa Infantry, promptly charged and overran the artillerists. The men of the Poison Spring, the men of the 29th, the men of the 2nd Kansas screaming, "Poison Spring!" 3 Missourians were bayoneted as they tried to surrender, and the Kansas were prepared to do the same to 6 captured rebels when several Iowa soldiers came to their aid. "The Negroes want to kill every wounded Reb they come to, and will do it if we do not watch them," Milton Chambers of the 29th Iowa reported. He added that one of our boys seen a little Negro pounding a wounded Reb in the head with the butt of his gun and asked him what he was doing. The Negro replied, "He is not dead yet." In a grisly reprise of Poison Spring in reverse, black soldiers prowled the battlefield seeking wounded Confederates. A Texas private reported that after Kirby Smith's army fell back, "I looked around and saw some black Negroes cutting our wounded boys' throats, and I thought my time would come next." Though he managed to escape, many others did not. A Texas soldier wrote that we found that many of our wounded had been mutilated in many ways, some with ears cut off, throats cut, knife stabs, etc. My brother was shot through the body, had his throat cut through the windpipe, and lived several days. I saw several who were treated in the same way. One officer wrote on a bit of paper that his lower jaw and tongue were shot off after the battle was over during the falling back. Confederate James Dawson wrote that the Negroes killed some of our wounded, but very few, but when they fall into our hands, they fare bad sure. Retaliation would follow for the wounded soldiers of the 2nd Kansas after the battle. Sergeant William L. Nicholson of the 29th Iowa Infantry wrote that one rebel, dressed as an officer, drew his revolver and shot 3 wounded blacks who lay in the yard. Nicholson said that he protested this brutal violation of the hospital flag and was nearly shot himself. 2 weeks later, the rebels moved Nicholson and the 6 surviving 2nd Kansas men to a more permanent hospital at Princeton, Arkansas. The blacks were placed in a small warehouse. They had not long been deposited, Nicholson wrote, when I heard shooting, and someone remarked, "The blacks are catching it." Nicholson saw a Confederate soldier emerge with a smoking revolver in each hand. "I went over at once," he wrote, "and found all the poor Negroes shot through the head." Steele's army disengaged and crossed the Saline River, destroying the pontoon bridges for lack of draft animals to transport them. Indeed, the Union Army destroyed the majority of their wagons as they struggled through the glutinous mud of the Saline River bottoms. Michael Zimmer of the 9th Wisconsin wrote, "Most horses and mules gave up. It was terrible to see how the exhausted and starving animals got stuck in the mud and collapsed in the middle of the road. Thus you could see hardly more than just their heads sticking out of the mud now and then. We had to put them out of their misery." Andrew Sperry of the 33rd Iowa observed, "Many as were the wagons that had been destroyed, the train still stretched out apparently 2 or 3 miles. When a wagon stuck and all the wagons were constantly sticking, every endeavor was made to raise it out of the mud and get it moving again. If all means failed, the mules were unhitched and wagons broken and burned, and so all over the swamp near the road were burning wagons and their scattered contents." The starving Federals wearily slogged toward Little Rock, and on the evening of May 2, they finally received some desperately needed supplies. As Jacob Haas of the 9th Wisconsin remembered, it was nearly night when suddenly a rush came into camp. All the lame and discouraged ran in one direction as if they were new men. "Hurrah! Crackers! Plenty crackers." Now we get hurrah. It came from all directions. Several loads of crackers had arrived from Little Rock. In greatest hurry, they were unloaded and distributed. Joy everywhere, and then sweet sleep. Finally, on May 3, Steele's haggard army at last returned to the safety of Little Rock. Michael Zimmer of the 9th Wisconsin wrote, "Today at 6 o'clock we left for Little Rock and arrived there at noon. The platoon was arranged and we went marching a parade step through the town. First the 2 captured cannons and 2 secessionist flags came, then our regiment, then the other regiments in the order they are arranged in brigades. Thus one brigade followed the other and we marched to our camp. Oh, how happy I was when I could move into my cozy tent." Another Yankee remembered, "The next day in the afternoon we arrived in Little Rock, each fort firing honor salvos. All the troops were lined up at attention and we marched through the whole city between presented arms. But how did we look? Some did not have any hats, others no shoes, others no coats, others torn pants. In short, we looked like a corps of bandits. But one thing all of us still possessed, our weapons." Frederick Steele's invasion of southern Arkansas was a smaller failure within the larger disaster that was the Red River Campaign. The Federals suffered around 2,750 casualties and lost 635 wagons, 2,500 animals, and 8 pieces of artillery. But while the Confederates repulsed the Union advance, they failed to destroy Steele's army. Confederate totals reflected less loss, with 2,300 casualties, 35 wagons, fewer than 100 animals, and 3 artillery pieces, and 1 steamship destroyed. Well, the grisly violence at Poison Springs, Marks Mills, and Jenkins Ferry revealed a marked downward turn in the conduct of the Trans-Mississippi armies in the closing months of the Civil War. As black troops played an increasingly important role in swelling the ranks of the Union Army, Confederate troops became increasingly brutal of their treatment of the former slaves who had the audacity to take up arms against their former masters. It is thus not surprising that these same former slaves would themselves commit atrocities as the Civil War became increasingly uncivil. As C.H. Pidcock of the 30th Texas Cavalry noted, I no longer wonder that the war in Arkansas is war to the knife." If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email at mchrist@cals.org, and have a nice day.